Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. At COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, there were 131 heads of government in attendance, and that makes it the largest conference of political leaders ever in history. The build-up to that conference was phenomenal, as most of you will remember, and the outcome was a total disaster for the climate change movement. The conference was hijacked, as it is said, by the BASIC group. It's important to realise the BASIC group, which are the initials of Brazil, South Africa, India and China. It's important to recognise that the climate conferences are really all about that group. These are the four countries which will provide more than half of all of the expected emissions over the period between now and the middle of the century. At Copenhagen, the BASIC group met separately. The President of the United States gate-crashed that meeting, so he was lucky to find out before everybody else what the decision was going to be. The leaders of the European Union only found out when it was announced to the conference as a whole. So the decision was taken by that small group. And you'll see in the slide what the reaction of some of the activists were, what the reactions were to that conference. At about the same time, or just before the conference, the ClimateGate emails had come out and had got a good deal of press. And then there was the crash of December 2009. And it did look in the early part of 2010 as if the whole climate change movement was pretty much dead and buried. Well, we should have put a stake through its heart then, because it's been working ever more rapidly in recent times to resurrect it, essentially by means of COP21, which will be held in Paris at the end of next year. The objective, the goal of COP21 is on the slide. They are looking to a legally binding and universal agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now that may not be as ambitious as the Copenhagen goals, which included, you may recall, as my colleague Lord Monckton pointed out, within the hundreds of pages of script was to lay the foundations for a world government. In fact, the world was their oyster. They were going to decarbonise the world. There was nothing that was beyond their reach at that time. This is going to be more modest in COP21, but more in some ways turns on it because it's going to be the last chance saloon. If it doesn't happen in Paris next year, then there probably won't be any more chances. And I'm making two predictions in regard to COP21. These are not scenarios or projections, they're predictions, that it will be an embarrassing failure. Although the conference is to be held at the end of next year, it's not due to come into effect until 2020. And the reason for that is that it has to be then ratified by individual governments all through the 193 countries who are expected to be signatories to this treaty. So there will be, because it's intended to be a legally binding treaty, there will be debates on country by country over a period of years, and the negotiators at Paris next year will be painfully aware of the fact that this is going to be a long-winded debate. The irony of it is that the goal of not exceeding 2%, not exceeding 2 degrees of warming, will be achieved in any case. That is my second prediction. And that's, of course, a very good reason why the first prediction should come true. There is no need for COP21. More and more people are becoming aware of that fact. There are three reasons why I predict that it will be an embarrassing failure. Three categories of reasons, if you like. And the first is the track record of these COPs. There's been 20 of them. They've all been failures. Each one of them has wish lists in advance. None of them have ever achieved those wish lists. There hasn't been one success that they can point to and to say that was the pinnacle of our achievement. Going right back to when it all started in Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992, it was agreed and set out in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that the developed countries expected to reduce their emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2000. Well, what happened, in fact, was that they increased their emissions by 20% by the year 2000. The next serious effort was Kyoto in 1997. The outcomes of Kyoto were a dismal failure. During the period from the beginning of the Kyoto period, 1990 to 2012, the end of the Kyoto period, during that period, world emissions increased by 60%. Kyoto is mainly a European convention. It is heavily Eurocentric, and yet Europe increased the percentage of its energy that it gets from coal increased from 43% to over 50% during that same period. Then in 2007, there was the Bali conference, and they set out the Bali roadmap, which was aimed at the basic countries. And the objective was to have the basic countries, in particular China, to enter into voluntary targets. Unlike the Kyoto Convention, which was legally enforceable, the Bali roadmap was intended to entice the basic countries to enter into voluntary targets. Well, in short, they simply refused. They've shown no indication that they are in any way sympathetic to the proposal. They talk about energy intensity. They talk about predicting where they might be in terms of setting targets or setting out to reduce to some cap. There's been no sign of it. Then there was Copenhagen in 2009, which we've already covered, and it was, of course, a total fiasco. And in Cancun in 2010, it was agreed that they were going to have this green climate fund of $100 billion a year. This was really more about redistribution of global wealth than it was about climate, but it was seen as the means to provide reparations, as they called it, to the developing countries and allow the developed countries to virtually buy off the guilt of having filled the atmosphere with the emissions of the previous decades. The Green Climate Fund has never been funded. It became pretty clear at Warsaw last year that it's not going to be funded. Suggestion is that it should be obtained from the private sector. That's a sort of a woolly view that the investments that are made through the Climate Fund are going to pay off in some way, which is totally opposed to the concept of reparations. This is money, conscience money, to be paid out, and I don't see much prospect of that being paid for by the private sector on a voluntary basis. So the track record so far, there's been no reduction in emissions. They are greater than ever. There's been no country has adopted climate policies that are reducing their level of emissions. Some, particularly the US, are enjoying a reduction in emissions, but that's not as a consequence of climate policy. So they've got no runs on the board after the first 20 COPs, and so there's a very good grounding for saying one shouldn't expect much from the COP21. The second category of reasons why it won't happen next year is the negotiating climate, which has become much tougher than it was in 2009. A major argument made in a lot of countries, particularly in the UK, was the peak oil argument, that it was only going to be a matter of time, and not very much time, before pricing was going to become very volatile and in fact unpredictable. It wouldn't be possible to build power plants. Nobody would be able to predict what the price of gas or any other fossil fuel was going to be. So they had to get off that whole chain and get into a different way of doing things. So this peak oil prospect, which has been around for so many years, is now virtually dead and buried with a stake through its heart. The current level of reserves, the years of forward recoverable reserves and known reserves, are at a level higher than they've ever been in history. Even though we're using more than ever before, the recoverable reserves are higher than ever before. So that peak oil argument, which was important, no longer available. Another sort of co-benefit argument was green growth, green jobs. I don't need to tell an American audience about the stimulus policy and what a great success it was. There have been so many studies now done, I think in particular of the one in the UK by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which establishes that for every job you get in the green energy sector, you lose 2 jobs in the rest of the economy. And of course that was preceded by a study in Spain, which was the subject of a presentation at the last Heartland conference, which found something very similar, that if you want to destroy jobs, green growth is the way to go. So that one's gone. Subsidies, as we have heard, subsidies in Europe have started to fall away, and the momentum for renewable energy is running out fast. Carbon markets, you can't underestimate what a huge effect the finance lobby had a few years ago. Governments everywhere can't afford to ignore the finance lobby. Bankers, the big 4 accounting firms, everybody in the finance sector had a major interest in introducing the largest commodity for trading in the world. It was going to be larger even than currency. That's pretty much gone away. Carbon markets have fallen flat. The EU is barely on life support, and it's not coming anywhere else. The next issue is the popularity, and I won't spend any time on opinion polls. Most of you are familiar with where they have gone. But the question of momentum in terms of policy, as I say, the EU ETS has sort of dwindled right away. The only 2 countries, if you go back to 2009, everybody was expected to have an ETS before long. It was going to become near universal. And yet there's only 2 countries that have followed and have actually established ETS schemes. The first of those was New Zealand. Last year they passed legislation to cut it in half. The second one was Australia. This week they'll pass legislation to repeal it. So that's the way the world is going, and it's going in the opposite direction to the hopes that are built on COP21. Beyond all that, when it comes to the ratification process, there's going to be one argument I think is going to be very difficult to overcome. Sorry. This quote by Matt Ridley, that this year the IPCC have come out with two different predictions. One of them on the cost of doing nothing, and the other on the cost of pursuing climate policy. And as Matt Ridley so wisely questions, why would we want to do more harm than good? Thank you.